So I'm posting quite a bit today, but I'm kind of fired up because we are really at a critical time right now. And let me tell you this, it is not a coincidence that our health, the health of our population, is tied to the health of the planet. And both of them are at a critical issue right now. Our health system cannot possibly care for the amount of disease that's coming in and that will be coming in the future. Cardiac disease is our leading source of death. It's absolutely epidemic. Obesity is rising at epidemic rates, so is diabetes. The central issue facing us as a country, our solvency, our economy, is going to be dependent on how we treat illness. The major crisis we have right now is not on a stupid southern border. It is the health of our population. Meanwhile, there are now predictions that there will be no fish in the sea by 2048. We have climate change happening at alarming rates now. And I published today on my Instagram an article by The Lancet that is an amazing article, which is a large meta-analysis looking over multiple prospective studies and randomized controlled trials. And you got to understand that when we do these large studies, when scientists look at these large studies, they control for different factors. And so you really almost take away the benefits of a plant-based diet and then look, because for instance, they'll control for weight. Well, if you control for weight, that's one of the great ways that a plant-based diet helps you. But they want to try to even things out. And even after doing all this control, that study found what they said was a striking correlation between the amount of good carbohydrates you eat, the amount of fiber, the amount of whole grains, and the non-communicable diseases that we encounter, such as heart disease and diabetes. Now, you got to understand, for a group of scientists to be doing a study and use the word striking, that is very, very rare. And they even say in that study, even though they're looking for the most part in correlations, although they did look at randomized controlled trials, they did say that it suggests that the correlations are actually causative. You almost never hear that when a scientist releases a study that's looking at epidemiology, because in epidemiology we are looking at correlation. Though you got to understand, where there's smoke there's fire. This is just one study. There's been multiple studies like this, multiple studies. And at the same time today, there was a report released by the Epic Eating Group, which is 30 of the world's premier scientists on food and environment and health. And after reviewing all of the science and the data, they've concluded, as the World Health Organization has concluded, as the IPCC has concluded, and that is that we have to do something about the way we eat in order to protect our environment. We have to eat less meat. We have to. The only way that our planet will survive is us to eat a predominantly plant-based diet. This has nothing to do with veganism. This has to do with changing the way we eat, because there is such a huge demand right now for animal protein. And that huge demand for animal protein drives big corporations to try to sell animal protein. In order to meet that demand, they have to create what are called CAFOs, these controlled feeding operations, where millions, even billions of animals are stuffed into a small little area. Now, because they're stuffed into a small little area, they tend to get diseases, and you do eat diseased animals every time you eat something that's coming from a CAFO, which, by the way, is the vast majority of the food that you eat, the vast majority. And so it turns out that CAFOs are the #1 users of antibiotics, and that antibiotics does get into our system. They also need to feed these animals, and so in order to feed these animals, we have to grow large monocultural crops, because we're not feeding these animals a whole varied diet. We're feeding them corn and grain and soy. And so the vast majority of the crops, when you're driving through Nebraska and all you see is this grain everywhere, the vast majority of that is going to feed these animals. Now, in order to grow monocultural crops, that's not a healthy way of raising your soil. You're supposed to have a whole bunch of different crops. And if one crop dies because it gets a bug or something, then the other crops can grow. But when you grow a monoculture crop, if one bug hits you, you lose all your crops. So therefore, what do you have to do? You've got to spray pesticides. And those pesticides leak into our soil. And GP, for instance, just destroys the soil, destroys it. Our topsoil is wasting away. There's not even earthworms can live in our soil anymore. And that GP then soaks into our soil, gets into our rivers and destroys the life in our rivers, and then gets into our oceans and destroys the life of our oceans. Meanwhile, these CAFOs with these billions of animals stuffed in there produce billions of tons of waste. And that waste gets into our soil. And that waste they build these waste lakes, and that seeps into our rivers, and it kills off our rivers and causes algae blooms that further kill off things. And the animals produce CO2 and methane in huge amounts, huge amounts. This is not a sustainable way of feeding ourselves and feeding the world. It's just not sustainable. Meanwhile, we're out fishing the oceans, and we fish the oceans with trawlers that have tons of bycatch, so they throw away the bycatch. But if you're throwing away the bycatch, that's the food to other animals in there, and you've totally destroyed the ecosystem. We've gone and destroyed ecosystems everywhere. We are in the sixth massive extinction of life right now. We're losing species daily. And all of this really can change if we shift to a predominantly plant-based diet. If we really, instead of funding Tyson or funding the producers and giving incentives to farmers to produce the food that will go to feed these CAFOs, if instead we were giving that to small farms, to local farms, if we were using our dollar as a vote in buying plant-based food so that we changed the demand to more plants and more plant-based food, and even took that demand further, demanded non-GMO crops, demanded no pesticides, demanded that we got organic food, demanded that we had regenerative farming and permaculture. And we could do that. We have the power to do that, but we have to do that. We have to do it now, because our health, our financial health, and the health of our population and the health of our world is absolutely dependent on us doing it right now. Right now, it is now time. And do it for yourself, do it for your health, and do it for your kids. Our kids are going to inherit an absolute disaster. And I think we owe it to them to turn this around now, because the truth of the matter is we could completely turn it around. We could change everything. We could feed the world. We could change our health, but it's going to take action. We can't just look at these feeds and look at these stories and just forget about it. The science is absolutely clear. The time for debating is gone. The time for action is now.